Hi everyone, my name is Dom and I'm a product manager for the Sparklite team. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can convert your spreadsheets into API using the Sparklite platform and then subsequently integrating that API into the Bubble platform. And for the example today, we'll be using a dad jokes generator because ultimately who doesn't like a good dad joke and who doesn't like a bad pun? So the basis of this app is actually very simple. So I just created a few elements here on the screen. And essentially when I hit this component, I've mapped it so that it will send an API call to the Sparklite application and then subsequently return the response for this given API. So to understand the basis of this logic, we obviously have to go into the source of this data. And ultimately that sits in our Excel file. So just very quickly, a brief intro of this file. It's actually very basic. So we have two tabs here. We have the generator and then we have the data tab. So in the data tab, we ultimately have a list of about 50 jokes. Every row has an index number and a corresponding joke and punchline. So what I've done here is essentially I've created free fields here. So my input field here will read and do a lookup of essentially the index number on the data tab. And then subsequently using the index matching function, it will return both the joke and the punchline. And the way that Sparklite recognizes this when we upload is essentially we do what is called an X input and X output mapping. So all that is that we use the name range manager here and select a field that we're interested in. So if I want to take the input and output and convert it to the API, then I would do an X input mapping for that given field. So very simply here, I've just mapped it and using the name range manager, just call it X input underscore index. And then subsequently on my outputs, I have both the joke and punchline. And the convention is the same. I've just called it X output, which is the convention for Sparklite underscore joke, and then X output underscore punchline. So once that is done, we can go ahead now and upload our spreadsheet on the Sparklite platform. Okay, so now that we're on the Sparklite platform, we want to go ahead and upload our spreadsheet. So let's click on Create New API. We'll go through this upload journey. I select Browse and find that spreadsheet I was working on. Essentially, what's happening now is that Sparklite is going to cycle through that spreadsheet and essentially identify all of the X input and X output mappings that I've made on that spreadsheet. So that's essentially the X input index and the two X output fields. And then here it's just converting that to API. And in a few moments, like we see here, it's created that API for me. So just a very quick summary here of everything that's been converted. As you can see here, we have that one input field and the two output fields that have been converted here. So let's go ahead and access our API. So as you can see now, I can see that the dad jokes demo spreadsheet has been converted, and I have access to an API endpoint here, which I can take immediately. We can actually also dive into this API by seeing API details here and having a look at, again, some details here regarding the API. So again, I have access to the endpoint here. I also have access to an API tester. So if I wanted to just test the API logic, I can run some tests. So essentially this will be one-to-one with the spreadsheet. As you can see, just by changing the index input here, I can get a response of the punchline and joke. And just finally as well, we do have some pre-built formats here for integration. We do have a integration method for Bubble, Retool, and of course Postman. For the demo today, I will be showing you guys how you can do this much easily with our new Bubble plugin. Okay, Now that we're happy with our API, we can actually go ahead and start creating our front-end application. So firstly, let's go ahead and copy this endpoint, and then let's go to the Bubble app. So I've just created a blank canvas again, just to walk you through how exactly I created that app. So firstly, we probably want to add a name for this application. Of course, we're gonna call it the dad joke generator. And let's just center that here. Then we want to add a image element. Of course, we want to have a picture of our dads here. Then let's just center that as well. Then let's also add our button here. So essentially this button will act as our trigger point. So every time you click it, it will just refresh the page, and a new API call will be made to the Sparklite application, and essentially it will just cycle through our jokes and punchlines. Okay. So next, what we want to do is we want to add something called random number. So random number isn't by default on the list here for the visual elements, but you can actually find it if you go to plugins and just search for this. But the reason why we want this as a field is because we want to apply this to our index number. So if you recall, we had a list of 1 to 50. So essentially what random number does, like it says on the name, it just cycles through basically whatever you define as the local minimum and maximum. It will just spit out a number between that. So this essentially will be our input field, and it will just assign that random number, and as a result we'll get the corresponding output according to this input. Cool, so that's it from the front end. We'll come back to this in a second. The next thing that we need to do is actually now define the logic of how that API call is made. To do this, we'll be using the workflow editor of the application, and here we'll be able to define what exactly happens when the page is loaded or when you click on a certain element, for instance. So let's go ahead here and add a new element. And firstly, we're going to select when page is loaded under general. And here we're going to add an action and go down to plugins. So you won't be able to see this by default, but essentially you firstly have to install the Sparklite API plugin on the plugin library. To do this, let's go to the workflow editor here, where essentially you'll be able to define what exactly happens, for instance, when the page is loaded or when you click on a certain element. So let's go ahead and add a new event, and we're firstly going to work on when the page is loaded. And let's add an action and go down to plugins and find Sparklite API. Just an FYI, this won't appear by default, so you will have to firstly install the Sparklite API plugin in the plugin library. So let's go ahead and select Sparklite API, and essentially a dialog will appear here where you can essentially paste in that API endpoint that we had just copied from the Sparklite application. And then the next thing we want to do is set the input and map it to a specific element on the front end here. So if you recall, our input was called index, and basically we want index to tie up with that random number element that we've just created. So we're just going to find that element here, and we're saying here that we want to take that number. So again, based off of the parameters we've set from 1 to 50, it will just generate that number and then act as our input here. Cool. And then finally, if you ever need to add more inputs, then you can always set another key and value here, and then just obviously define your inputs here. But just remember that the input name here has to be exactly the same as what you have on the Sparklite platform, otherwise it won't work. Okay, Cool, so our next step now is to define our output. So now that we have our step 1 API request, step 2, we just want to go here and then select element actions and then set state. And we're essentially going to create our output state. So let's go ahead first and find our dad jokes demo interface. So this is the page name actually of where we want the output to be returned. We want to create a new custom state. So let's go ahead and call this outputs. And let's just select text here and then select create. Finally, we just want to define this as a result of step 1. So essentially, we're saying that this response will return based off of whatever value we have here, which is essentially the index value. Cool, now that we've defined our API request on step 1 and our response on step 2, we can actually test this out on the design front end. So I'm just going to drag a text element here, just make this a bit bigger. And here essentially I want to return the response or the output that I've defined on step 2. So in this list, let's just go ahead and find that name. Basically, this will be the name of the page. And then we want to find outputs. So this is the custom state that we essentially just created. And now we're ready to test that one out. So if you remember, the logic is that when the page is loaded, make a request and then return the response based on step 1. So as you can see, we've successfully integrated into the Sparklite application, as I now have the correct response here. So as the next step, we probably want to beautify this a bit, as the format here is not really suitable for a user. So all we want to do here as the next few steps is we can just maybe minimize this for now. We essentially want to go to the left-hand nav and find read JSON. So just FYI, this isn't available by default, so you will have to just quickly install it. Essentially, we're just going to drag 2 elements here. And what these elements do essentially is that it can take certain parts of a JSON and then separate it so that you can organize it a bit better on the front end. So I'm just going to define this one as joke, and I'm going to find that response. So it'll be just again, the dad jokes demo output. So this will just return the joke element, and like separately, we're just going to do that for punchline. And again, here we just want to find that custom state. And that's that. And just finally, because these aren't text elements, we want to create 2 additional text elements here. And we want to point it to these respective read JSON elements here. So again, insert dynamic data, and we're going to define this as read JSON A's text value. And then conversely here, again, we'll find this for read JSON B text value. So read JSON A was the joke and read JSON B was the punchline. So now if I try to preview this, this will be delimited. Whoops, I guess this is a bit shrunken, so we can just expand that a bit. Let's try that again. There we go. So now we have the joke and the punchline separated into a more user-friendly format. Cool. So just as the very final step, how do we make it more easy if we want to cycle the jokes based on that index of 1 to 50? So as the last step, if you recall, in our workflow here, when the page is loaded, it will basically take that random number element and assign a random number, and as a consequence, a set of outputs will be displayed. So just as a final step here, we can also just map that button that we have in the front end. So we're going to just create a new event. Under elements, we're just going to select an element is clicked. Here we will define which exact element we're looking at. So when an element is clicked, the element will be button hit me. So when this button is clicked, we want to refresh the page. So this will be under navigation and refresh the page. And that's pretty much everything here. We can just test that out again. So let's just click on preview. Of course, when the page is loaded, it will display the response. But if I want to cycle through and reload it again, it will just again cycle through those index numbers. Of course, we probably need to just do some additional formatting here, but at least we've created and integrated our application with the Sparklite API. Thanks, everyone.